tropical sun beat down on Clark Air Base in the Philippines as Major Frank T. McCoy approached the abandoned aircraft. It was January 31st, 1945, and what he was about to discover would fundamentally change American understanding of Japanese aviation philosophy. Before him sat an intact Mitsubishi G4M bomber, tail number 763-12. The Allies called it the Betty. Nearly 20 meters long with a 25-meter wingspan, it looked formidable. Its twin radial engines were undamaged, its sleek cylindrical fuselage gleaming in the afternoon light. This wasn't salvaged wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber, simply abandoned by its crew as American forces recaptured the base. McCoy commanded the Technical Air Intelligence Unit for the Southwest Pacific. He'd examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft, piecing together their capabilities from twisted metal and shattered components. But this was different. This was an opportunity to understand the enemy's premier land-based bomber from the inside out. When he climbed through the wing inspection panels, what he found stopped him cold. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compounds, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems beyond basic extinguishers. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating nearly 5,000 liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy gunfire. For a moment, McCoy must have thought there'd been some mistake. Perhaps this was a prototype, or a damaged aircraft with protective systems removed. But as his team conducted a systematic examination over the following weeks, the truth became undeniable. This was standard Japanese design. Every G4M ever built shared these characteristics. American bombers in 1945 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The technology had become so fundamental that U.S. aircraft designers considered it non-negotiable. Self-sealing tanks used layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact with fuel. When punctured by bullets or shell fragments, the material expanded into the holes, preventing fuel loss and dramatically reducing fire risk. The system added substantial weight, but American doctrine deemed crew survival worth any performance penalty. Yet, here was Japan's most important bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks offering zero protection against combat damage. The weight savings were immediately apparent to McCoy's engineers, but so was the cost. American pilots had been reporting for years that Betty bombers exploded into flames from minimal damage. Now they understood why. This discovery would answer questions that had puzzled Allied intelligence since the war's first days. How could an aircraft so effective in early campaigns become so devastatingly vulnerable? Why did the same bomber that sank British battleships in 1941 burn in overwhelming numbers by 1942? What were Japanese engineers thinking? The answer lay in decisions made years before the war began, in engineering calculations that prioritized range above all else, and in assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. The first strike. 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, the Betty bomber announced its presence to the world. As smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 108 Japanese bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The formation included 82 G4M Bettys and 26 older G3M bombers. The attack achieved complete surprise. Arriving at noon, the Japanese formation cruised at 20,000 feet, beyond the effective range of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the lead wave dropped over 600 bombs across Clark Field's runways and aircraft parking areas. Minutes later, 0 fighters swept in at a treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew northward. "What struck me was their formation discipline," he later wrote. "Perfect spacing, high altitude, completely beyond our reach. Then the fighters came down and systematically destroyed everything. We couldn't get a single plane airborne." But what truly stunned American intelligence analysts was the distance those bombers had traveled. The Japanese had struck from bases 460 miles away. No American bomber could match that range in December 1941. The Betty had operational reach that gave Japan strategic flexibility. Allied commanders couldn't counter. 2 days later, the Betty demonstrated even more devastating capability. Death of Force Z. On December 10th, 1941, 26, G4M bombers joined older G3M aircraft in attacking British naval forces off the coast of Malaya. The target was Force Z, built around 2 of the Royal Navy's most powerful warships, HMS Prince of Wales, a modern battleship, and HMS Repulse, a battle cruiser. The attack began just after noon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that shocked British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms, with a 200-kilogram warhead. These were specifically designed for shallow water operations. The attacks focused on the capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, displacing 43,000 tons and representing Britain's newest naval technology, took at least 6 torpedo hits. The underwater explosions tore massive holes in the hull, flooding overwhelmed damage control. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese planes, but couldn't stop the coordinated assault. Both warships capsized and sank within 2 hours of the initial attack. 841 British sailors died. For the first time in naval history, capital ships underway and actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power. The Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Through early 1942, Betty bombers seemed to operate with impunity. They struck Darwin, Australia, from bases 1,500 miles away. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. They hit Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles. The bombers' operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond enemy fighter range, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases, enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. But these advantages depended entirely on one assumption: minimal fighter opposition. the turning point. By mid-1942, that assumption began to collapse. As American fighter strength increased, as Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. The shift became undeniable. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in what would become the single worst G4M loss of the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. Betty bombers exploded into flame with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to burst into flames from battle damage. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, commanding a Corsair squadron at Guadalcanal, later reported, "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere and they'd explode. We actively hunted them." From August through October 1942, over 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in sustained fighting that Japanese air forces could not sustain. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Betty formations would depart Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of Guadalcanal. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that couldn't be replaced. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men killed. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. The engineering gamble. To understand why the Betty burned so easily, we need to return to September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the aircraft's entire existence. The specifications were extraordinary. Top speed of nearly 400 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, and range of 4,700 kilometers while carrying 800 kilograms of bombs. These weren't arbitrary numbers. Japanese naval planners calculated the distances their forces would need to cover in any Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From the home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could meet these requirements. The designer tasked with this challenge was Kairo Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi team. He'd studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European engineering principles before returning to Japan. Honjo understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises Western air forces would never accept. The mathematics were brutal. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. nearly 4,800 litres, weighing approximately 3,800 kilograms at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel weight, the aircraft needed minimal empty weight. These requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating to protect crew positions would weigh hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks required additional rubber compounds and structural reinforcement. Fire suppression systems added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction, no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells, no redundant safety measures beyond basic fire extinguishers. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity and range. The decision wasn't made casually. Honjo's team calculated the vulnerabilities this would create. They knew combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew the Navy's requirements couldn't be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. Early success, fatal flaw. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. It exceeded every expectation. Speed surpassed projections. Range was extraordinary. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. The bomber's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force Z demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under specific conditions. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond enemy fighter range, the Betty was devastatingly effective. But the moment American fighter strength increased, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw. Betty formations could strike distant targets, but they couldn't survive the fighter opposition necessary to defend those targets. There was no middle ground. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. Japanese engineers recognized modifications were essential. Starting in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These weren't true self-sealing tanks, just minimal protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour and decreased range by over 300 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They couldn't prevent fires from larger rounds or cannon shells. A more comprehensive solution came with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks, but capacity was reduced to accommodate the protective material. Maximum range decreased to 3,600 kilometers, a loss of over 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. Yamamoto's last flight. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most historically significant moment on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the Combined Fleet, would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville that morning. He would travel aboard a G4M bomber with fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 in the morning, flying at 50 feet above the ocean. At 9:34, exactly on schedule, and with precision that would become legendary, they spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from formation to engage the bombers. Barber attacked the lead Betty, carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority: signals intelligence, precision planning, flawless execution. But it also demonstrated that once a Betty came under attack, there was no possibility of survival. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured any damage would be catastrophic. The final mission. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MX-7 Oka rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200-kilogram warhead, designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. But the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. CEF-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets couldn't survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. Surrender. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms. The aircraft, given call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, flew to Ieshima, where the delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent. The call signs referenced Bataan, where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. The bomber that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941 now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission. The final count. Total Betty production reached approximately 2,400 aircraft across all variants. The G4M Model 1 comprised about 1,170 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. The Model 2 accounted for approximately 1,140 examples. The Model 3, with actual self-sealing tanks, saw only 60 to 91 aircraft completed. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, only a handful of operational Bettys remained. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were devastating. Thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. Former Flight Petty Officer Masanobu Ibusuki, who completed 28 combat missions, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. 2 philosophies. The comparison with Allied bombers highlights stark differences in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating, protecting pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates up to 8 millimeters thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from 1941. The B-17's empty weight reflected substantial protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, despite similar size. American studies demonstrated the effectiveness of these measures. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers. But American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed surprise and initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The price of range. When Major McCoy examined tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945, he was witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident. They were a deliberate decision. Japanese designers created exactly what their specifications demanded. An aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for mission requirements. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about future warfare. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The Betty bomber became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. American engineers examining the intact Betty weren't just analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing what happens when performance is purchased with crew lives. The aircraft served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank battleships and devastated air bases. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match. But its ultimate legacy is written in loss statistics that exceeded all projections. The crew of tail number 763-12 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers, crossed vast Pacific distances, and died in overwhelming numbers. Consumed by fires the aircraft's design made inevitable. The lesson. The Betty bomber's story is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range of 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when aircraft couldn't survive the final 100 kilometers to target. The impressive speed provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept with radar warning. The payload capacity became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Most importantly, the Betty reveals what happens when military technology is divorced from realistic assessment of combat conditions. The assumptions underlying the Betty's design, assumptions about limited opposition and short war duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection, even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field provided final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the air war in the Pacific.